Who were the conquistadors?
Conquistador is the Spanish word for conqueror. The Spaniards who arrived in North and South America in the late 1400s and early 1500s were just that, conquerors of the American Indians and their lands. In many cases, the Spaniards were the first Europeans to arrive in these lands, where they encountered native inhabitants including the Aztec of Mexico, the Maya of southern Mexico and Central America, and the Inca of western South America. By the mid-1500s these native peoples had been conquered, their populations decimated by the Spanish conquistadors. The conquest happened in two ways. First, the Spaniards rode on horseback and carried guns, while their native opponents were on foot and carried crude weapons such as spears and knives. And second, the European adventurers brought illnesses, such as smallpox and measles, to which the native populations of the Americas had no immunities, causing the people to become sick and die. By 1535 conquistadors such as Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475 to 1541, Hernan Cortés, 1485 to 1547, and Vasco Núñez de Balboa, 1475 to 1519, had claimed the southwestern United States, Mexico, Central America, and much of the West Indies, islands of the Caribbean, for Spain.
What is Bessemer steel?
Developed during the early 1850s. The Bessemer process was the first method for making steel cheaply and in large quantities. Named for its inventor, British engineer Henry Bessemer, 1813 to 1898. The process was also developed independently by William Kelly, who patented the process in 1857, in the United States. Bessemer and Kelly experimented with injecting, blowing, air into molten pig iron, crude iron. The oxygen in the air helps rid the iron of its impurities, such as manganese, silicon, and carbon, converting the iron to molten steel, which is then poured into molds. The process was introduced in the U.S. steel manufacturing industry in 1864. Alloys were also added to the refining process to help purify the metal. Within 2 decades, the method was used to produce more than 90% of the nation's steel. It was also implemented throughout the industrialized world. In the mid-1800s, rich iron ore deposits had been discovered in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, along Lake Superior. The discovery of the minerals and the innovation of the Bessemer process combined to create a thriving steel industry in the United States. At the same time, there was a growing market for the material. Railroads needed iron to make rail gauges, while the new auto manufacturing industry used steel to make cars. As a result, between 1880 and 1910 annual U.S. steel production increased by a factor of 20. One of the early industry leaders was Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919. who in 1873 founded the nation's first large-scale steel plant, at Braddock, Pennsylvania. In 1901 Carnegie sold this and other steel mills to the United States Steel Corporation. Today the USX Corporation, which is the largest steel producer in the United States. The Bessemer process continued to be used until after World War II, 1939–45. The open hearth method of purification gradually replaced it.
Who was Hoyle?
Edmund Hoyle, 1671 or 1672 to 1769, was an English card player who, in 1742 at the age of 70, published short treatise on whist, which provided the rules for a game that developed into auction bridge and later into contract bridge. Hoyle's name has survived among bridge players in the phrase "according to Hoyle."
What were lords?
Lords, or seigneurs, were wealthy landowners during the Middle Ages, 500–1350. By about the 9th century, much of Western Europe was divided into huge estates, called manors. These were self-sufficient estates that were held by a lord. Members of the clergy could also be lords. The lord would lease land to peasants who would farm it, in return. The peasants would pay the lord in taxes, in services, or in kind, with crops or goods. In addition to farmland, a manor would typically have meadow, woodland, and a small village. The lord presided over the entire manor and all the people living there. As the administrator of the land, he collected taxes and presided over legal matters. But the manors were not military entities, in other words. The lord did not promise protection to the peasants living on his land. As such, the manors were purely socio-economic, as opposed to fiefs, which were social, economical, and political units.
How many died in the September 11th attacks?
About 3,000 people died that day as a result of the terrorist attacks on the United States. The strikes on New York's World Trade Center claimed 2,602 lives. And another 125 died at the Pentagon, outside Washington, D.C. The numbers include firefighters and police officers who died as part of the rescue effort. The victims on board the hijacked flights, which were used as terrorist weapons, numbered an additional 87 on American Airlines Flight 11, which crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 60 on United Airlines Flight 175, which crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 59 on American Airlines Flight 77, which slammed into the Pentagon. And 40 on United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in rural Shanksville, Pennsylvania. In February 2005, officials announced that they had exhausted all possible methods of identifying the human remains recovered at Ground Zero. Of the 2,749 people reported missing at the World Trade Center, positive identification had been made on 1,161 people. The rest were presumed dead. 2,749 death certificates were issued related to the World Trade Center attack.
What did the United States gain from the Mexican War?
The Mexican War, 1846–48, was officially ended when the U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on March 10, 1848. By the treaty, Mexico relinquished roughly half its territory, New Mexico and California, to the United States. Mexico also recognized the Rio Grande as its border with Texas. Mexico received payments in the millions from the United States, which also assumed the payment of claims of its citizens. 5 years later, under the terms of the Gadsden Purchase, the United States purchased a small portion of land from Mexico for another $10 million, which was widely regarded as further compensation for the land lost in the war. The territory the United States gained was in present-day Arizona and New Mexico, south of the Gila River.
Who was Balanchine?
The name of the Russian-born choreographer is synonymous with modern American ballet. George Balanchine, 1904–1983, was one of the most influential choreographers of the 20th century, creating more than 200 ballets in his lifetime and choreographing 19 Broadway musicals as well as 4 Hollywood films. He co-founded 3 of the country's foremost dance institutions: the School of American Ballet, in 1934, the American Ballet Company, 1935, and the New York City Ballet, 1948, the first American ballet company to become a public institution. His entrance into the world of dance was entirely accidental. In August 1914, Balanchine accompanied his sister to an audition at the Imperial School of Ballet and was invited to audition as well. Though his sister failed, he passed and, against his own wishes, was promptly enrolled. However, Balanchine remained uninterested in the art form, even running away from school shortly after starting. The turning point for the young dancer came with a performance of Tchaikovsky's ballet The Sleeping Beauty, 1890. He was dazzled by the experience and chose to stay with the school's rigorous training program. Serenade, 1935, music by Tchaikovsky, is considered by many to be Balanchine's signature work. His other well-known works include Apollo, 1928, The Prodigal Son, 1929, The Nutcracker, 1954, and Don Quixote, 1965, as well as Jewels, the first full-length ballet without a plot. Remembering the opportunity he had been given as a child, Balanchine was known for choreographing children's roles into many of his ballets. His outreach did not end there. He organized lecture demonstration tours for schools, gave free ballet performances for underprivileged children, conducted free annual seminars for dance teachers, and gave free advice and use of his ballets to other ballet companies. Balanchine's unparalleled body of work was instrumental in establishing the vibrant style and content of contemporary ballet in America, where he brought ballet to the forefront of the performing arts.
Why are Thomas Paine's philosophies important to democratic thought?
English political philosopher and author Thomas Paine, 1737–1809. Believed that a democracy is the only form of government that can guarantee natural rights. Paine arrived in the American colonies in 1774. 2 years later he wrote Common Sense, a pamphlet that galvanized public support for the American Revolution, 1775–83, which was already underway. During the struggle for independence, Paine wrote and distributed a series of 16 papers called Crisis, upholding the rebels' cause in their fight. Paine penned his words in the language of common speech, which helped his message reach a mass audience in America and elsewhere. He soon became known as an advocate of individual freedom. The fight for freedom was one that he waged in letters. In 1791 and 1792 Paine, now back in England, released The Rights of Man, in 2 parts, a work in which he defended the cause of the French Revolution. 1789–99, and appealed to the British people to overthrow their monarchy. For this he was tried and convicted of treason in his homeland. Escaping to Paris, the philosopher became a member of the Revolutionary National Convention. But during the Reign of Terror, 1793–94, of revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, 1758–1794, Paine was imprisoned for being English. An American minister interceded on Paine's behalf, insisting that Paine was actually an American. Paine was released on this technicality. He remained in Paris until 1802, and then returned to the United States. Though he played an important role in the American Revolution by boosting the morale of the colonists, he nevertheless lived his final years as an outcast and in poverty.
What were Pasteur's discoveries on disease?
Louis Pasteur, 1822–1895, may be best known for developing the process that bears his name, pasteurization, but the French chemist and microbiologist made other important contributions to public health, including the discovery of vaccines to prevent diseases in animals and the establishment of a Paris Institute for the study of deadly and contagious diseases. In the 1860s, the hard-working Pasteur was asked to investigate problems that French winemakers were having with the fermentation process. Spoilage of wine and beer during fermentation was resulting in serious economic losses for France. Observing wine under a microscope, Pasteur noticed that spoiled wine had a proliferation of bacterial cells that produce lactic acid. The chemist suggested gently heating the wine to destroy the harmful bacteria, and then allowing the wine to age naturally. Pasteur published his findings and his recommendations in book form in 1866. The idea of heating edible substances to destroy disease-causing organisms was later applied to other perishable fluids, chief among them milk. Pasteur later studied animal diseases, developing a vaccination to prevent anthrax in sheep and cattle. The deadly animal disease is spread from animals to humans through contact or the inhalation of spores. In 1876, German physician Robert Koch, 1843–1910, had identified the bacteria that causes anthrax. And Pasteur weakened this microbe in his laboratory before injecting it into animals, which then developed an immunity to the disease. He also showed that vaccination could be used to prevent chicken cholera. In 1881, Pasteur began studying rabies, an agonizing and deadly disease spread by the bite of infected animals. Along with his assistant, Pierre-Paul-Émile Roux, 1853–1933. Pasteur spent long hours in the laboratory, and the determination paid off. Pasteur developed a vaccine that prevented the development of rabies in test animals. On July 6, 1885, the scientists were called on to administer the vaccine to a small boy who was bitten by a rabid dog. Pasteur hesitated to provide the treatment, but as the boy faced certain and painful death from rabies, Pasteur proceeded. Following several weeks of painful injections to the stomach, the boy did not get rabies. Pasteur's treatment was a success. The curative and preventive treatments for rabies, also called hydrophobia, we know today are based on Pasteur's vaccination, which has allowed officials to control the spread of the disease. In 1888, the Institut Pasteur was established in Paris to provide a teaching and research center on contagious diseases. Pasteur was director of the institute until his death in 1895.
What happened at 3 Mile Island?
The March 1979 accident, a near meltdown at the nuclear power station at 3 Mile Island, outside Middletown, Pennsylvania, near Harrisburg, was eventually contained. Had it not been, the damage would have been on a level with that of the Chernobyl, Ukraine, disaster, which happened some 7 years later. Instead, 3 Mile Island served as a wake-up call, reminding the American public and its utility companies of the potential risks involved in nuclear energy. The sequence of events at the nuclear power plant, which is located on an island in the Susquehanna River, was as follows: at 4 a.m. on Wednesday, March 28, an overheated reactor in Unit 2 of the power plant shut down automatically, as it should have. Metropolitan Edison Company operators, guided by indicators that led them to believe water pressure was building, and an explosion was therefore imminent, shut down those pumps that were still operating. The shutdown of all the pumps caused the reactor to heat further. Then, tons of water poured out through a valve that was stuck open. This water overflowed into an auxiliary building through another valve that was mistakenly left open. This final procedure, which took place at 4:38 a.m., released radioactivity. Since there was no cooling system in operation, the reactor in Unit 2 was damaged. But this was not the end of it. The radiation within the buildings was released into the atmosphere. And at 6:50 a.m. a general emergency was declared. Early that afternoon, the hydrogen being created by the uncovered reactor core accumulated in a containment building and exploded. Since hydrogen continued to be emitted, officials feared another catastrophic explosion. Worse yet, they feared the reactor would become so hot that it would melt down. The effect of a meltdown would be that the superheated material would eat its way through the bottom of the plant and bore through the ground until it hit water, turning the water into high-pressure steam, which would erupt, spewing radioactivity into the air. As technicians worked to manage the crisis, radiation leaked into the atmosphere off and on through Wednesday and Thursday. On Friday, the governor of Pennsylvania ordered an evacuation. Some 144,000 people were moved from the Middletown area. The situation inside the plant remained tenuous as a hydrogen bubble developed and increased in size, again raising fear of explosion. Meantime, public alarm was mounting as the media attempted to monitor the ongoing crisis. Finally, on Sunday, April 1, the plant was visited by President Jimmy Carter, 1924. At about the same time, the hydrogen bubble began to decrease in size, ending the crisis.
What caused the Russo-Japanese War?
From 1904 to 1905, the war was fought by Russia and Japan over their interests in China, particularly Manchuria and Korea, areas of strategic importance to each country. Before fighting broke out, Japan moved to settle the conflict, but the overture was rejected by Tsar Nicholas II. 1868 to 1918, and Japan soon severed all diplomatic relations, on February 6, 1904, with Russia. 2 days later, the Japanese issued a surprise attack on Russian ships at Lushan, Port Arthur, Manchuria. On February 10, Japan officially declared itself at war with Russia. The battles both on land and at sea went badly for the Russian forces, which could not be adequately reinforced or supplied to meet the powerful and disciplined Japanese. Early in 1905, the war effort already unpopular back home. Revolution broke out in Russia, further weakening the country's resolve. After an 8-month siege at Lushan, it became clear that Russia could no longer muster a fight. Further, the war was expensive for Japan, which sought the intervention of the United States in settling the conflict. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, became involved in mediating the dispute. A peace treaty was signed September 5, 1905, at a shipyard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, following 1 month of deliberations. The terms of the treaty were these: both nations agreed to evacuate Manchuria. Russia ceded to Japan the southern half of Sakhalin Island, which lies between the two countries. The island was ceded back to Russia after World War II. Korea became a Japanese protectorate, and Russia transferred to Japan the lease of China's Liaodong Peninsula. And so Japan emerged as a power onto the world scene.
What were the 5-year plans?
These were the plans initiated by Premier Joseph Stalin. 1879 to 1953, of the Soviet Union to speed industrialization of the USSR.
What were continentals?
Continentals were the paper money issued by the U.S. government during the American Revolution, 1775 to 83. The Second Continental Congress, which governed the new nation after the Declaration of Independence. 1776, ran the war effort against Great Britain. The governing body did not have the power to levy taxes, since no constitution had been drawn up yet. So the Congress appealed to each state to contribute to the war fund. However, states that did not face imminent danger, those in which there was no fighting, often did not answer the call. Many of the new nation's most prominent citizens remained loyal to the British and refused to contribute money to the American patriotic cause. Yet money was needed to buy supplies and ammunition, and to pay soldiers. In order to finance the revolution, Congress was compelled to issue paper bills, which promised holders future payment in silver. But as Congress issued more and more continentals, the currency became devalued because there was not enough silver to back up the promised payments. By 1780 there were so many continentals in circulation that they had become almost worthless. The phrase "not worth a continental" was used by Americans to describe anything that had no value. To help solve the financial crisis, some patriotic citizens contributed sums of money. In exchange, they received interest-bearing securities from the government. But funds continued to be scarce. The problem of funding the revolutionary effort was not solved until foreign powers stepped in to aid the fledgling nation in its fight against the powerful British. European loans to the United States, notably from France, were instrumental in the American victory in the Revolutionary War.
Who were the barbarians?
The term is used to refer to any of the Germanic tribes that, during the middle of the first millennium A.D., beginning about 400, repeatedly attacked Rome, eventually conquering it and dividing the territories of the West Roman Empire into many kingdoms. While what was the East Roman Empire survived as the Byzantine Empire. The Germanic tribes included the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, and the Lombards.
What was the impact of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan?
When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979 to bolster a pro-communist government in the Middle Eastern nation, no one could have anticipated the far-reaching effects that would be felt decades later and around the globe. What immediately followed was a 10-year civil war, in which Soviet troops fought Afghan guerrillas, or the Mujahideen. The war in Afghanistan became a jihad, or holy war, and a rallying point for many Muslims, with the conflict drawing young men from across the Muslim world to fight on the side of the guerrillas. According to the 9/11 Commission report, mosques, schools, and boarding houses served as recruiting stations in many parts of the world, including the United States. The war was a virtual stalemate for 7 years. But a turning point came in 1986 after the United States and Great Britain supplied shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles to the Afghan guerrillas. The weaponry gave the scrubby ground forces a fighting chance against Soviet air power. As the 9/11 Commission report asserts, together with Saudi Arabia, the United States supplied billions of dollars worth of secret assistance to rebel Afghan groups resisting the Soviet occupation. Thus supported, in April 1988 the Afghans declared victory. And early the next year the Soviet troops began to withdraw. The war was over, but it had fueled an extremist Islamic ideology, the jihad as holy war, and put into place an infrastructure out of which emerged a powerful and deadly terrorist network. Though most Muslims hold peaceful views, a minority of Muslims view any non-Muslims as unbelievers. It was from this minority, trained and financed as a result of the Afghan war, that the global network of terrorists called Al-Qaeda emerged.
What is the Protestant ethic?
The Protestant ethic is a term describing a set of attitudes fostered by the leaders of the Reformation. Martin Luther, 1483–1546, John Calvin, 1509–1564. John Knox, 1513–1572, Huldrych Zwingli, 1484–1531, Conrad Grebel, c. 1498–1526, and their Protestant successors such as Methodist Church founders John Wesley. 1703 to 1791, and Charles Wesley, 1707 to 1788. These church leaders stressed the holiness of a person's daily life, the importance of pastors to lead family lives, versus the celibacy of Catholic monks and nuns, education and study, and personal responsibility. According to these beliefs, the person who is hardworking, thrifty, and honest is a good person of value to their community and to God. From 1904 to 1905, German sociologist Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, wrote an essay called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, asserting that Protestant principles contributed to the growth of industry and commerce during the 1700s and 1800s, since the hard work, investment, and savings of individuals help build a capitalist economy.
What were the worst earthquakes of the past century?
In order of magnitude on the Richter scale they were: Chile, 1960, 9.5, Prince William Sound, Alaska. United States, 1964, 9.2, Andreanof Islands, Alaska, United States, 1957, 9.1, Kamchatka, Northeast Russia. 1952, 9.0, off the coast of northern Sumatra, Indonesia. 2004, 9.0, off the west coast of Ecuador. 1906, 8.8, Rat Islands, Alaska, United States. 1965, 8.7, Assam, India and Tibet. 1950, 8.6, Kamchatka, Northeast Russia. 1923, 8.5, Banda Sea, Malay Archipelago. 1938, 8.5, and Kuril Islands. Off the east coast of Asia, extending from Russia in the north to Japan in the south. 1963, 8.5.
How could the world body have allowed such an event to happen? Particularly with the Nazi Holocaust a not too distant memory?
Again, there is no easy answer. The United Nations withdrew its people when the violence began in April 1994, but some UN officials estimated later that perhaps as few as 5,000 troops might have been able to prevent the annihilation. The United States did not intervene in the Rwandan genocide. The recent images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, Somalia, in October 1993, had left the country reticent to involve itself in the world's hotspots. But, even with the lesson of Rwanda, experts wondered how the international response might differ today.
Who were the Puritans?
The Puritans were members of a religious movement that began in England in the 1500s and lasted into the first half of the 1600s, when it spread to America as well. Influenced by the teachings of religious reformers John Wycliffe, c. 1330 to 1384, and John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, the Puritans were so named because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England. They believed too much power rested with the church hierarchy, its priests, bishops, and cardinals. That the people, called the laity or lay members, should have more involvement in church matters. And that the ceremonies ought to be simplified to stress Bible reading and individual prayer. Further, they defied the authority of the Pope, believing that each church congregation should have control of its own affairs, which should be guided by a church council, called a presbytery, made up of lay members. These ideas are familiar to Americans today since they provided the basis not only for many Protestant churches but also influenced the formulation of U.S. government. When the Puritans faced persecution at home, they became religious pilgrims, traveling to the New World, where they established both their religious and social belief system.
How long has the waltz been danced?
Considered the quintessential ballroom dance, the waltz first became popular in Europe in 1813. But it dates as far back as the mid-1700s. The first written occurrence of the word waltz was in 1781. In the 1850s the dance captivated Vienna, and the prolific Johann Strauss, 1825 to 1899. Also known as the Waltz King, produced scores of new waltzes to meet the increasing demand. Many of the compositions were named for professional associations and societies. One of the most well-known waltzes is the Blue Danube. First performed by Strauss on February 15, 1867, in Vienna. The lyrics, from a poem by Carl Beck, were sung by the Viennese Male Singing Society. The new waltz created an immediate sensation. It is an Austrian tradition whenever the Blue Danube is played that the opening strain is played first, followed by a pause before the work is played by the full orchestra. The pause is so that the audience may applaud.
What were the Hussite Wars?
The Hussite Wars were fought in the former Kingdom of Bohemia, part of present-day Czech Republic. Between 1420 and 1433, the country was plunged into the 13-year war by festering hostilities between papal forces and Bohemian peasants. The Hussites, named such since they were followers of religious reformer Jan Hus, c. 1373 to 1415, in the Four Articles of Prague, 1420, the Hussites called for freedom of preaching, limits to church property holding, and civil punishment of mortal sin. The fighting ended in 1433 with the compromise of the Council of Basel and 3 years later was officially ended by the Compact of Igo, 1436. In which a faction of the Hussites agreed to accept the Holy Roman Emperor as king. The peasants had succeeded nevertheless in asserting Bohemian nationalism and had severed the country's ties to Germany.
Why is the equation E equals mc2 historically significant?
The famous equation was put forth in 1905 by German-born physicist and Nobel laureate. 1921, Albert Einstein, 1879 to 1955, and became important to history largely because it, along with the quantum theory, developed by Max Planck in 1900, laid the foundation for nuclear energy. It is part of Einstein's theory of relativity, 1905, 1916. In the formula, E is energy, m is mass, and c squared is a constant factor equal to the speed of light squared. The equation illustrates the relationship between, and exchangeability of, energy and matter. In the 1930s, when scientists discovered a way to split atoms, the minute particles of which elements are made, they learned that the subatomic particles that were created have a total mass less than the mass of the original atom. In other words, when the atom was split, part of the mass of the atom had been changed into subatomic particles, but some of it had been converted into energy. Using Einstein's formula E equals mc2, the scientists calculated how much energy was produced by splitting an atom. This atom splitting method for creating energy is the basis for nuclear energy. The term nuclear refers to the atomic process, which uses the nucleus or central portion of an atom to release energy. Today, we live in the nuclear age, where power and weapons are produced using the atomic process for creating energy.
What were the 10 plagues?
The 10 plagues were delivered by God to the people of Egypt as a way of convincing the Pharaoh that he was to let the Israelites go so Moses could lead them out of bondage and into the promised land. The plagues were, in the order described in Exodus, 1. Water turned into blood, 2. Frogs, 3. Gnats, 4. Flies, 5. Pestilence, 6. Boils, 7. Hail, 8. Locusts, 9. Darkness, and 10. Death of the firstborn. It was not until the 10th plague had been delivered that the Pharaoh agreed to let the Israelites leave.
How do the 2004 Southeast Asia tsunamis rank among natural disasters?
The Southeast Asia tsunamis killed more people than any tsunami ever recorded. The series of seismic waves that rushed across the Indian Ocean on December 26, 2004, caused damage of biblical proportions and prompted a humanitarian rescue and aid effort on an unprecedented scale. That morning a 9.0 earthquake occurred off the northwestern tip of the island of Sumatra, Indonesia. Witnesses to the tsunamis reported that following the earthquake, ocean waters receded from shorelines hours before the giant waves roared in, washing over islands and sweeping through coastal villages in 12 countries, including Indonesia, Myanmar, India, and Sri Lanka. The waves struck as far west as the coast of Africa. More than 150,000 people died in the disaster. Indonesia's death toll alone surpassed 85,000. The international response was immediate and reached into the billions of dollars. Nonetheless, relief efforts were hampered by remote island locations, the destruction of infrastructure, and ongoing conflicts in some areas. In the weeks following the tsunamis, officials recognized that the true death toll would take time to be known. Since survivors had yet to be interviewed about relatives and friends who remained missing, it was expected that many had been washed out to sea and thus had not been counted in the initial death toll, which was based on body counts. A preliminary report from the World Bank put the damages at $4.5 billion in Indonesia alone. But officials acknowledged that it would take months to calculate damages. The earthquake that struck the morning of December 26, 2004, was the third biggest earthquake in the past 100 years, and the biggest since 1964, when a 9.2 magnitude tremor occurred off Alaska. Scientists believe that the Southeast Asia quake occurred about 6.2 miles beneath the ocean floor and caused a great protrusion in the seabed, generating waves that moved across the ocean in the early morning hours. Though probably not huge when they were out at sea, the waves grew higher as they approached shore, as tremendous volumes of water were forced to the surface.
What is the Copernican view of the universe?
The Copernican view of the universe, proposed in 1507, argued that Earth was only one of several galactic bodies that orbit the Sun. This theory, put forth by Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, Mikołaj Kopernik, 1473 to 1543, was controversial in its day because it ran counter to the astronomical beliefs that had held sway for some 1,400 years, those of the Ptolemaic system, which maintained that Earth is the center of the universe and that the Sun and the planets all revolve around it. Copernicus devised his scheme out of necessity. Really, he had found that using the Ptolemaic system to predict the positions of the planets over long periods of time yielded haphazard results. Once he made the assumption that the Sun, rather than Earth, is the center of the solar system and that all the planets orbit the Sun, Copernicus realized that tables of planetary positions could be calculated much more easily and accurately. However, Copernicus was not the first to put forth such a radical idea. The Greek astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, c. 310 to 230 BC, was the first to maintain that Earth rotates on an axis and revolves around the Sun. But it was Ptolemy's ideas that took hold, not Aristarchus's. Copernicus did, however, take the argument a step further, averring that Earth itself is small and unimportant compared with the rest of the universe. But the Copernican view had its problems, too. Copernicus assumed that the planetary orbits were perfectly circular. Because of this error, he found it necessary to use some of Ptolemy's cumbersome epicecles. Smaller orbits centered on the larger ones. To reduce the discrepancy between his predicted orbits and those that he observed. It was not until the early 1600s that the elliptical orbit of the planets was put forth by German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630.
What does "Remember the Alamo" mean?
The saying was a rallying cry for Texans in their war for independence from Mexico. The movement for independence had begun in the winter of 1835 to 36 when the people of Texas decided to cut off relations with Mexico, and soon turned into a war when the Mexican government sent a force of some 4,000 troops, under the command of General Antonio López de Santa Anna, 1794 to 1876, to squelch the rebellion. As the Mexican army approached, the force of about 150 men who were determined to defend the city of San Antonio retreated to the Alamo, a Spanish mission built in the previous century. There they were joined by another 50 men but were still no match for the Mexicans, who kept the Alamo under siege for 13 days from February 23 to March 6, 1836. The Texans, low on ammunition, ceased to return fire. On the morning of March 6, Santa Anna's troops seized the Alamo. The fierce frontiersman, Davy Crockett, 1786 to 1836, among them, are believed to have fought using the butts of their rifles. All the Texans who fought that day at the Alamo died. Meantime, General Sam Houston, 1793 to 1863, had assembled his forces, and with the rallying cry "Remember the Alamo," and their fellow Texans who had bravely fought and died there, he set out to face the Mexican army and secure independence. This he did, at San Jacinto, Texas, on April 21, 1836. In a quick and decisive battle that had caught Santa Anna's troops by surprise. The following day the Mexican general was captured and made to sign a treaty giving Texas independence.
How old is philosophy?
Philosophy, apart from religion, emerged in the East and the West at about the same time, roughly 600 years before Christ, before the Common Era. It was then that thinkers in Greece began questioning the nature of existence. and it was c. 500 BC when Confucianism was formulated in China. Philosophy has long been intertwined with religion, including Hinduism, which developed about 1500 BC. But as a pursuit of wisdom in and of itself, philosophy is roughly 2600 years old. Western philosophy is divided into three major periods: ancient, c. 600 BC AD 400. Medieval philosophy, often called scholasticism, which also included Eastern thinkers, 400s to 1600s, and modern philosophy, since the 1600s.
What is D-Day?
The military uses the term D-Day to designate when an initiative is set to begin, counting all events out from that date for planning. For example, D-Day -2 would be a plan for what needs to happen 2 days before the beginning of the military operation. While the military planned and executed many D-Days during World War II, 1939–45, most of them landings on enemy-held coasts. It was the June 6, 1944, invasion of Normandy that went down in history as the D-Day.
How many leaders did the Soviet Union have?
From its formation in 1922, just 5 years after Tsarist Russia had fallen in the Revolution of 1917. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, had only 10 leaders. But just 5 of these had meaningful tenure, either due to length of time served or true authority: Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev. After Tsarist Russia ended with the Revolution of 1917, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, 1870–1924, became head of the Soviet Russian government as chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. The Communists, dissolving the elected assembly and establishing a dictatorship. This lasted 6 years. When Lenin died of a stroke in 1924, Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, who had been an associate of Lenin, promptly eliminated his opposition and in 1929 established himself as a virtual dictator. Stalin ruled the USSR during World War II, 1939–45. And though he was aligned with the United States, Britain, and the other Allied nations during that conflict, soon after the war, he began a buildup of power in Eastern Europe, leading to the Cold War, 1947–89. Even though Stalin's domestic policies were extremely repressive and he ruled largely by terror, he remained in power until his death in 1953. After Stalin died, the Soviet Union entered a brief period of struggle among its top leaders. Deputy Premier Georgy Malenkov, 1902–1988, a longtime Stalin aide, came to power. In 1955 Malenkov was forced to resign, and he was succeeded by his and Stalin's former defense secretary, Nikolai Bulganin, 1895–1975. However, Bulganin was a premier in name only. The true power rested with Communist Party Secretary Nikita Khrushchev. 1894 to 1971, who expelled Bulganin and officially took power as premier in 1958. Khrushchev denounced the oppression of the long Stalin years, which had ended only 5 years earlier, and worked to improve living standards. On the international front, he pursued a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West and even toured the United States in 1959, meeting with President Dwight D. Eisenhower. 1890 to 1969, in 1960 a U.S. reconnaissance plane was shot down over the USSR, raising doubts among the Soviets about Khrushchev's policy toward the West. Further troubles at home resulted from widespread hunger due to crop failures. Meantime, Khrushchev advanced the cause of Soviet space exploration, beginning the so-called space race with the United States. Eventually, his stance on international issues, which included a rift with Communist China, led to his downfall. He was removed from power in October 1964. Khrushchev's ouster, which was a forced retirement, had been engineered by his former ally and political advisor Leonid Brezhnev, 1906 to 1982. With Khrushchev out of the way, technically Brezhnev was to lead the country along with Premier Alexei Kosygin, 1904 to 1981. But as head of the Communist Party, it was Brezhnev who truly held the power. By the early 1970s, Brezhnev emerged as the Soviet chief even though Kosygin remained in office until 1980. During his administration, Brezhnev kept tight control over the Eastern Bloc, communist countries, built up the Soviet Union's military, in what became an arms race with the United States, and did nothing to try to reverse the downward trend of the Soviet Union's economy. When Brezhnev died in 1982, he was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, 1914 to 1984. However, Andropov died 2 years later and Konstantin Chernenko, 1911 to 1985, replaced him as premier. When Chernenko, too, died an untimely death in March 1985, Mikhail S. Gorbachev, 1931, became head of the Communist Party and leader of the Soviet Union. With Gorbachev, the reign of the old guard of Stalin-trained leaders had come to an end. Gorbachev's policies of openness to the West and economic development led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, with communist rule ending in 1991 and each Soviet republic setting up its own government.
When did rail service in the United States reach from coast to coast?
On May 10, 1869, the last tracks of the United States' first cross-country railroad were laid, making North America the first continent to be spanned from coast to coast by a rail line. The event was the fulfillment of a great national dream to knit the vast country closer together. Short-run rail lines had been in use since the 1840s, but the nation lacked a method for transporting people, raw materials, and finished goods between distant regions. In the early 1860s, U.S. Congress decided in favor of extending the railroad across the country. The federal government granted land and extended millions of dollars in loans to two companies to complete the project. After a long debate that had become increasingly sectional, the legislature had earlier determined the railroad should run roughly along the 42nd parallel from Omaha, Nebraska, to Sacramento, California. This route was settled on for its physical properties. The topography of the landscape would best allow the ambitious project. The Union Pacific Railroad was to begin work in Omaha and lay tracks westward. The Central Pacific Railroad was to begin in Sacramento and lay tracks eastward, crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains. Work began in 1863, and 6 years later the two projects met at Promontory in north-central Utah, northwest of Ogden. The Central Pacific Railroad laid 689 miles of track eastward from Sacramento, while the Union Pacific Railroad laid 1,086 miles of track westward from Omaha. 600 workers, including numerous Irish, Chinese, and Mexican immigrant workers, attended the May 10, 1869, ceremony celebrating the accomplishment. The last steel spike that was driven into the railroad was wired to a telegraph line. When the spike was pounded, a signal was sent around the world to announce the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. By the end of the 1800s, 15 rail lines crossed the nation.
Why is Rembrandt considered the archetype of the modern artist?
To understand the similarities between Rembrandt van Rijn, 1606 to 1669, and the modern artist, it's important to note that this master portrait painter, who broke ground in his use of light and shadow, was in his own time criticized for his work. Some thought it too personal or too eccentric. An Italian biographer asserted that Rembrandt's works were concerned with the ugly, and he described the artist as a tasteless painter. Rembrandt's subjects included lower-class people, the events of everyday life and everyday business, as well as the humanity and humility of Christ, rather than the choirs, trumpets, and celestial triumph that were the subjects of other religious paintings at the time. His portraits reveal his interest in the effects of time on human features, including his own. In summary, the Dutch artist approached his work with psychological insight and profound sympathy for the human affliction. He was also known to use the butt end of his brush to apply paint. Thus, he strayed outside the accepted limits of great art at the time. Art critics today recognize Rembrandt as not only one of the great portrait painters, but a master of realism. The Dutch painter, who also etched, drew, and made prints, is regarded as an example for the working artist. He showed that the subject is less important than what the artist does with his materials. Among his most acclaimed works are The Syndics of the Cloth Guild, 1662, and the return of the prodigal son. C 1665. The first painting shows a board of directors going over the books. And Rembrandt astutely captures the moment when the six businessmen are interrupted, thus showing a remarkably real everyday scene. The Return of the Prodigal Son is one of the most moving religious paintings of all time. Here Rembrandt has with great compassion rendered the reunion of father and son, capturing that moment of mercy when the contrite son kneels before his forgiving father. Through his series of self-portraits, Rembrandt documented his own history from the confidence and optimism of his youth to the worn resignation of his declining years.
What was the 30 Years' War?
The 30 Years' War, 1618–48, like the 100 Years' War, was actually a series of related conflicts, rather than one long campaign. The conflict in Europe began as a religious one, with hostility between Roman Catholics and Protestants. But it eventually turned political before it was ended with the Peace of Westphalia. The war had four periods: the Bohemian, 1618–24, the Danish, 1625–29, the Swedish, 1630–34, and the Swedish-French, 1635–48. In Bohemia, part of present-day Czech Republic, the trouble began in the capital of Prague when the Archbishop authorized the destruction of a Protestant church. The act angered Bohemian Protestants and those elsewhere in Europe who believed it was their right granted by the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, to worship as Lutherans. When Holy Roman Emperor Matthias, 1557–1619, failed to intervene on behalf of the Protestants, Prague became the scene of mayhem in May 1618.
What prompted widespread Irish emigration in the mid-1800s?
In 1845 Ireland's potato crop failed. Though crop failures in Europe were widespread at the time, the blight in Ireland was particularly hard-hitting because of the reliance on a single crop, potatoes, as the primary source of sustenance. The Great Famine that resulted lasted until 1848. The effect was a drastic decline in the Irish population due both to deaths and to emigration. Between 700,000 and 1 million people died in Ireland during the Great Famine. And between 1846 and 1854 alone, 1.75 million left the country in search of a better life elsewhere. 3/4 of those were headed to the United States. In the years after the Great Famine, experts determined that the blight of the late 1840s was caused by a fungus that was probably introduced to Ireland by a ship from North America, where there had been crop failures in the early 1840s. Sad irony that the very conduit that had likely borne the blight from North America to Ireland also carried immigrating Irish back to North American shores.